putting this at the beginning of the video because I'm not trying to make this trauma corn. I'm just trying to elucidate how terrible slavery was, because it's not okay the way it gets downplayed. It's essentially tantamount to like a 500-year Holocaust level event that just gets treated like an earmark of history, when in fact it's like the original sin of the Western world, or one half of it, in conjunction with the genocide of Native Americans. So let's talk about it. I first started to realize how downplayed slavery's been when I started reading books like The Black Jacobins. But that realization was made over new when I went to Ghana and visited some of the slave dungeons. There's a fair amount of conversation about what life on the plantation was like and life in the Middle Passage. And while that varied greatly, the worst of it is not talked about. And what's talked about even less is how bad it was before enslaved people even got on the boat. So after being marched up to hundreds of miles through the African interior to the coast, naked and chained, severely lacerated by all of the bush and bramble that they had to walk through, most enslaved people would be stopped at a final river or well to take a final bath. And as you'll see, because of how long this process was, that would potentially be their final bath for the rest of the year. Look what was on the ground right below me, Jamestown. So after potentially marching for weeks or months, they would arrive at the dungeons, which were also fortresses, to be processed. You'll notice that it's kind of got a ring shape to it. And while that's typical of any fortified structure, that ring shape was also conducive to the process that they had set up, with the express purpose of psychologically breaking the people they'd enslaved before they had to put them on a boat. Quick side story, these two buildings on the ramparts were used to imprison a female Nana and I think a male Nana during the British Ashanti Wars, which lasted almost 80 years. The Ashantis beat the British over and over again, but eventually over the course of a century, they were able to overtake them. And that ended in a treaty with King Kofi Karikari agreeing to give everything west of this certain river, which is basically Fanti land, to the British. So after being branded with iron rods, our ancestors would be separated by sex and put into these rooms. Hundreds at a time, that is not an exaggeration. It would literally be like pressed up against each other like sardines in a can, so that you literally had to suck in your stomach just for everyone to fit. And even then, it was so tight that if someone died, they died standing up. There was no other way to know that they'd died other than the fact that they'd stopped breathing, turned cold, or started to decay. And there was also no way to really remove them because it was so packed. So you would be forced to stand next to a corpse, potentially for months, because most people would end up waiting in these rooms for upwards of 6 months. With just 20 people in there, it was incredibly hot because of the body heat we were generating and the fact that it didn't really have anywhere to go besides these tiny holes. So imagine 170 people trying to fit into that. 200, 220. And this is actually the largest of the rooms. There were successively smaller rooms that they were moved into that became more and more cramped. Those who acted rebelliously were put in these rooms, which had no air holes, and left to die. No one survived the room, which is why it has the skull and crossbones on it. Just with 20, 30 people, again, it was so hot in there, we could only stay a couple of minutes. It was suffocating. And that's exactly what happened to everyone who went into that room, with the assumption that more and more people would die, and only the strongest and most capable would survive. Again, they would be in there from anywhere from 3 to 6 to 9 months waiting for the next ships to arrive. And there was only standing room, so if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to defecate on yourself. And when they first started excavating these rooms, I think in the 70s, because they'd been left in disrepair, just forgotten, like it didn't happen, they realized that the floor they were standing on was not the actual floor. They actually left a layer about 2 inches there and about 4 inches where you're looking at. The whole time we're walking through this area thinking we're on the floor, until they explain that it's actually the compacted excrement, dirt, tears, literal tears and blood, skin cells, so on and so forth, of the people who have been in this room year after year for hundreds of years, just compacted so much that it became a false floor. So when they're first excavating, I think you can kind of see it, but that line where it turns from lighter to darker is where it really was. Inches of literal human remains. Some female slaves were kept in this room. This is in the other dungeon, by the way. And the women in here were systematically R-worded, taken across this courtyard up to the officers' quarters to be assaulted. And when they displayed resistance, they were brought back and specifically and intentionally dunked into this. It's essentially a well, but it wasn't for drinking water. It was literally just to waterboard these women so that they would become too weak to fight back, and then they would be brought back up into the quarters. Again, like, the ship has not even arrived yet. This is months. And again, the rooms would become smaller and smaller until they were finally brought to the final room and led through a door, which is essentially like maybe 1.5 feet by 4 feet tall. you'd squeeze through that door and be led onto the boardwalk, onto the ships. And that's called the door of no return. Oh, and this is the craziest part. So remember the little air holes at the top of that first room I showed you? Those holes were positioned right below the steps of a building, so that anyone who was walking over the steps of this specific building would hear everything that was going on, and if they wanted to, could even peek in and see. And that building was their church. The Portuguese worshipped right over the slave dungeon with holes in it so that they could hear the screams of the people under them while they worshipped. No exaggeration. And when the Dutch took over Elmina Castle, this became the first Protestant church in Africa. So one of the first instances of Christianity touching West Africa was white people worshiping over the literal screams of the people that they were torturing. Fucking deranged. So after spending upwards of a year in this torturous process meant to break them psychologically and physically, they would finally be loaded onto these boats to endure the Middle Passage, which does get talked about, but also gets downplayed, before being brought to their respective plantations, which also gets talked about and extremely downplayed. And I'd like to talk about that too. And I'm not trying to make this trauma corn or anything like that.